All right, welcome back to The Explainer. So, we're continuing our journey through Marx's Capital. Last time, we talked about the secret of primitive accumulation. Today, we're digging into the history, the brutal story of how it actually happened. We're going to trace how the modern working class was born, a story that, as you'll see, has very little to do with saving and a whole lot to do with systematic and often violent expropriation. So let's start with the big question that Marx really forces us to deal with. Think about it. Our entire economic system depends on a huge group of people who are free laborers. But where did they come from? I mean, this class of people, the proletariat, who own nothing but their ability to work, they didn't just magically appear. So what's their origin story? Okay, just as a quick refresher from our last discussion, let's nail down this term, primitive accumulation. It's absolutely crucial to remember that for Marx, this is not about some thrifty person saving up their money. No, it's the historical process that literally rips apart the old ways of life, the process that separates people from the land and the tools they use to support themselves. Now, to really get a handle on just how massive this revolution was, we first have to understand what society looked like before it all happened. The whole story really kicks off in England, so that's where we're going to focus our attention. So Marx paints this picture of a society where, for the most part, serfdom had disappeared. The population was dominated by a class of independent peasants, yeomen. These weren't just renters, they were proprietors. They controlled their own means of production, the land, and because of that, they controlled their own survival. This is the world that had to be completely dismantled. The first huge shock to this system hits in the last part of the 15th century. It is a violent, disruptive wave of expropriation. You can think of it as the first act in a very long drama that's going to set the stage for everything that follows. So what lit the fuse? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was kind of a perfect storm of economic forces. You had a booming wool industry over in Flanders that made English wool incredibly valuable. At the very same time, the old feudal system was crumbling. Kings were breaking up the private armies of the nobility, which threw a whole bunch of people out of work. And the nobles themselves, they quickly figured out that wool meant cash, and cash was suddenly a lot more profitable than having people on their land. To really capture the sheer brutality of this moment, Marx actually quotes one of his contemporaries, Thomas More. It's this incredible line. People's homes were being torn down, their fields enclosed, all to make way for sheep pastures. The metaphor couldn't be more powerful. The sheep were literally devouring the men. So this is where our timeline begins. It kicks off with these initial brutal acts of dispossession. You have feudal lords just forcibly tearing down houses, kicking peasants off the land they had a customary right to, and turning that farmland into pasture. It was raw, violent change. Okay, now let's move on to the next great accelerator in this process, the English Reformation. Now, this wasn't just some theological argument, it was a massive economic event that basically threw gasoline on the fire of expropriation. You have to understand, the church was one of the biggest landowners in England, and its property was all tied up in that old feudal system. The Reformation, then, gave the religious cover for what Marx calls a colossal spoliation of this property. It was a massive and violent transfer of wealth. And the consequences were immediate, and they were huge. Monasteries were shut down, and the people living there were basically thrown into the ranks of the propertyless. The church lands themselves were either given away to royal cronies or sold for next to nothing to speculators, who then immediately kicked off the long-term tenants to consolidate their new properties. So you see, this religious reform just acted as a huge accelerant. It supercharged those initial enclosures and dramatically swelled the ranks of this new propertyless class. So after the raw, brute force of the 15th and 16th centuries, the methods of expropriation started to get a little more refined. The seizure of land put on a new mask, a legal parliamentary mask. And this is a really crucial shift. We're moving from illegal force to legal force. The very institution that was supposed to protect property, Parliament, becomes the tool for stealing it. By this point, landlords are the dominant power, and they use legislation to seize the common lands, which for centuries had been a vital resource for the rural population. So what looked like a legitimate bureaucratic procedure was, as Marx puts it, large-scale robbery carried out by the state. These enclosure acts systematically wiped out the ancient rights of the rural poor to use common lands for grazing their animals or gathering firewood, often the one thing that kept them from total destitution. And notice the irony there in that last step. They were set free from their last means of survival. So now that private violence we saw at the beginning has the full backing and sanction of state power. And it's all done under the very respectable banner of improvement. Okay, that brings us to the final and most ruthless phase of this whole process. This continued right into the 19th century, and the most infamous example is the clearings that took place in the Scottish Highlands. Marx's language here is just dripping with irony when he calls these methods idyllic. This final phase was all about sweeping away the very last traces of the old forms of property. In Scotland, for instance, the clan property of the Highlanders was just systematically converted into the private property of the clan chief, who then went about clearing the estates of people entirely. I mean, just look at this table. It lays out the cold economic logic of the whole thing, and it's drawn straight from Marx's sources. You have a population of 2,000 people living on 400 small farms. After the clearing, 0 people. They are replaced by 1 single shepherd and 20,000 sheep. In the new logic of capital, the animals were simply more valuable than the human beings. So when you step back and look at this whole centuries-long process, this history of force, plunder, and parliamentary theft, you realize it did 2 things at the same time. It concentrated land and wealth into the hands of a few, and it created a brand new social class, a class of people with absolutely nothing left to call their own. And here it is, the entire arc of the story. It's a relentless 400-year march of dispossession. It used different methods at different times, from feudal violence to church plunder to acts of parliament to the final clearings, but it was all headed in the same direction, to the same result. And this brings us right back to our opening question. The modern worker was created. They are, in Marx's famous phrase, doubly free. So what does that mean? Well, on the one hand, they're free from the old bonds of serfdom. Great. But on the other hand, they've also been freed from any ownership of the means of production, the land, the tools, anything. Their only choice, their only path to survival is to sell the one thing they have left, their ability to work. And that is the huge question that Marx leaves us with. This history forces us to really think about what free labor actually means in an economic system that's founded on this kind of violent dispossession. This new population didn't just happily choose to enter the factories. They were driven there. And that sets the stage perfectly for our next explainer, where we'll look at the bloody laws that were passed to discipline this new working class and force them into the wage system.